Let's begin with a gentle image of a warm Roman morning. The dust is rising. The marble is already warm to the touch. Someone somewhere has definitely overseen a pot of and the Colosseum, the architectural equivalent of a man flexing in the mirror, preparing for yet another day of elaborate, wildly unreasonable entertainment. And of course, because this is Rome, things are about to get a little absurd. We tend to imagine gladiatorial combat as this noble, balanced, and honorable test of strength. Two trained fighters, equal footing. Fair match. The whole thing conducted under the watchful eye of some stern but decent arena official. But no, Rome was many things, but fair was not one of them. The Colosseum was a place where emperors demonstrated their wealth, their power, and quite often their complete inability to make reasonable decisions. And nowhere is this better illustrated than in the beloved Roman tradition of the extremely uneven matchup. When the matchmakers were more chaotic than Cupid, let's drift first to the reign of Emperor Domitian, a man famous for two things: having the personality of a damp curtain, hosting arena events that made people question whether the gods had accidentally placed him in charge. Domitian had a habit of staging novelties. Now, a novelty in Roman entertainment usually meant someone had an idea that should have been dismissed after the first glass of wine but instead received imperial funding. He loved creating matches like dwarves versus women. Yes, that was one of his signature events. He advertised it like someone announcing a charming theater performance. The crowd would gather. The sun would shine. The dwarves and women would shuffle nervously into the arena. And everyone would quietly agree that this was, in fact, terrible. Domitian, however, thought it was delightful. We are not here to praise his taste. The emperor who thought animals were a perfectly reasonable opponent, but we can drift even further back, to the time of Titus the emperor, who decided the Colosseum should open with everything. When the Colosseum debuted, Titus spent 100 days showing the Roman people the many creative ways he could inconvenience the local wildlife. Lions, bears, panthers, elephants, and at least one animal that definitely did not sign up for this: the rhinoceros. The rhino, unsurprisingly, was unhappy. Titus, naturally, paraded it anyway. There were fights where experienced gladiators were matched against starved animals, while the emperor nodded approvingly, like he'd invented a new board game. It was an entire festival dedicated to proving that nature had lost the argument. And if you're wondering whether any of this seemed morally questionable to the Romans, not really. They were too busy enjoying the snacks. The emperor who tried to play gladiator, because of course he did now. We can't discuss unfair Colosseum matches without drifting over to Commodus, a man who looked at the concept of gladiator games and thought, yes, I, the emperor, should personally participate. I'm sure this won't be humiliating for anyone. Commodus would enter the arena wearing a shining helmet, polished armor, and the expression of a man who believed he was the moment. And then he'd challenge gladiators to fights, which, somehow, always won. This may have had something to do with the fact that the other gladiators were instructed not to kill him. It's amazing how well you fight when everyone else is legally obligated to lose. Commodus was especially proud of his skill with the bow and javelin. He enjoyed shooting at animals. The animals were tied down, of course, because accuracy improves dramatically when the target is unable to move or protest. At one point, he famously killed an ostrich, strutted around with its severed head, and made threatening gestures at senators with it. Imagine being a senator. You show up to work. You sit in the imperial box. You watch your emperor kill a large, slightly confused bird, and then he swings the head around like a prop in amateur theater. These people ran an empire. The fun events. Condemned prisoners as stage props. Let's drift to a quieter corner of the Colosseum, where practical effects were mostly achieved by human sacrifice. Rome adored reenacting famous myths using condemned prisoners, because that was cheaper than building props, and Rome loved a cost-effective solution. Picture it. Pick a prisoner dressed as Icarus. The crowd leans forward. He is launched into the air on a primitive mechanism that was absolutely not tested beforehand. And gravity does what gravity does. The Romans someone probably sold commemorative figurines. It was, in the clearest terms, not a fair fight. The ultimate mismatch. Nature versus logistics, of course. The Romans didn't limit their creativity to people. Sometimes they paired animals against each other in matches that really should have required a committee review. There are records of elephants fighting bears fighting lions, and once, allegedly, a scene where hundreds of animals were released at once. and proceeded to ignore each other and wander around in confusion. A lion walked past a bear. The bear sniffed a camel. The camel wondered what life choices led to this moment. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and then someone threw a javelin to liven things up. Rome had many talents. Coordination was not one of them. When the audience accidentally became participants, let's drift briefly to the time of Emperor Commodus. He was known for a lot of things, none of them good, but he did love attending the games. Unfortunately, he also had a habit of ordering his soldiers to attack the crowd when he felt slightly insulted. Imagine going out for the day, hoping to watch a tiger fight a bear, and suddenly you're the one dodging incoming spears. Not ideal, but very on brand for character. Even earlier, during the reign of Augustus, there were incidents where animals escaped into the crowd, because safety barriers were a concept someone would invent much later. Back then, it was more of a hope the lion is tired today situation. The calm behind the chaos. And yet, despite all the chaos, the Colosseum wasn't constantly violent. There were long moments of waiting, of preparation, of sun beating down on the sand, while workers reset the stage for whatever unreasonable event was coming next. You could almost imagine wandering the empty arena in the early morning, the hush before the crowds, the dust settling in soft spirals, workers muttering as they dragged props into place, an official reading a schedule that definitely made no sense. 10 a.m. 2 elephants versus 20 archers. Las 11 mock naval battle. Break for lunch. La 1 p.m. reenactment of the death of Hercules featuring real fire. It must have been exhausting, but for the emperors, it was a way to display power, wealth, and a flair for poorly planned theatrics. The least fair match of all. But perhaps the most unfair battle was simply this: human beings versus the expectations of an emperor. Because emperors expected everything: loyalty, applause, flattery, obedience, and the occasional willingness to be eaten by a lion if it made the afternoon program more exciting. And somehow, people went along with it, because that was Rome. The empire where things were big, loud, messy, and deeply unbalanced both in politics and in the arena. Let's drift onward. And so, we leave the Colosseum behind for now. The sand is stained, the crowd is dispersing, someone is sweeping up what appears to be either hay or lepifer. Hard to say, take a slow breath. We'll drift to our next chapter soon. But for now, let's let the arena fade into the dark. Take a slow breath. Imagine a long medieval hallway where every tapestry features at least one cousin marrying another cousin who definitely shouldn't. Because tonight, we're easing into the deeply questionable world of royal matchmaking where alliances mattered, love didn't, and genetics were something no one fully understood but everyone enthusiastically ignored. Royal marriages were rarely about affection. They were strategic arrangements, Sudoku puzzles solved by stressed advisors who believed that if two kingdoms shared enough DNA, peace would naturally follow. It did not. Let's drift gently into the dimly lit beginning. The Habsburgs, Europe's most committed gene-sharing enthusiasts. We have to start with the Habsburgs, not because they were the only guilty party, but because they treated intermarriage with the kind of dedication normally reserved for Olympic training. For the Habsburgs, the family tree wasn't so much a branching structure as it was a circle, a looping, self-referential doodle. By the 1500s, the dynasty had perfected the art of marrying uncomfortably close relatives to preserve the bloodline, which, ironically, they were steadily weakening like an overwatered plant. Take Philip II of Spain. At one point, he married his niece, and in the Commies, bedtime tome possible. Let's acknowledge that this was a bad idea. His father, Charles V, had already married his first cousin. And that was Charles, being restrained for the Habsburgs. Their proudest genetic achievement, of course, was the Habsburg jaw, a famously protruding chin that made entire portraits look like the sitter was mid-sire, trying to chew a piece of bread that wasn't tea there. One ambassador described the Habsburg prince's face as composed entirely of chin, gently harsh, but honestly fair. Charles II of Spain, a walk-in, wheezing cautionary tale. We can't drift through this topic without meeting Charles II, the final Habsburg king of Spain. A man who embodied the long-term consequences of centuries of extremely enthusiastic cousin marriage. Charles was nicknamed El Hechizado, the bewitched, because people assumed dark magic had to be involved. The truth was less supernatural and more genealogical. His family tree looked like a recycling symbol. Charles had severe developmental issues, chronic illness, a famously weak jaw, difficulty chewing, and a general aura of a man who wanted to lie down but had been told he was king and therefore not allowed. He married twice. Not for love, naturally, but because his advisors needed an heir, which he never produced. Both of his wives wrote home often, with letters that had strong "I am trying to be polite, but I am deeply alarmed" energy. One wrote, "He is kind, but very unwell," which his royal wife Codefort, "Please send help." When Charles finally died at 38, Europe collectively said, "Yes, that tracks," and immediately plunged into the War of the Spanish Succession, because even in death, Charles brought chaos. England joins in. The Tudors and their increasingly nervous advisors now. England wasn't as committed to biological experimentation as the Habsburgs, but they certainly contributed their share of marital misfortune. Let's drift to Henry VIII, a man whose romantic decisions read like a cautionary pamphlet handed out in health class. Henry married 6 women, which feels less like royal duty and more like a confused attempt at speedrunning the concept of matrimony. And yes, Henry's problem wasn't genetics, it was expectations. He wanted a male heir so badly that he cycled through wives the way some people cycle through New Year's resolutions. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, was actually his brother's widow, which made the entire marriage the royal version of, well, someone should use the leftovers. Henry claimed their failure to produce a surviving son was a sign from God. Convenient, since God's message perfectly matched Henry's desire to marry Anne Boleyn, and, of course, met an unfortunate end, because Henry's patience had the structural integrity of damp parchment. The Stuarts, where marriages were political and disappointment was inevitable. The Stuart dynasty brought its own flavor of marital dysfunction. Take Charles I and Henrietta Maria. They eventually grew fond of each other, but they began with the frosty enthusiasm of 2 people trapped in a long elevator ride. Charles was quiet, anxious, and prone to sulking. Henrietta Maria was lively, Catholic, and very aware that the English disliked both of those traits. Their arguments, while never dramatic, had a distinct "I'm not mad, just disappointed" tone on both sides. Their children inherited this mix of tension and anxiety, producing a generation of royals who specialized in being charming, broke, or both. Charles II, their son, married Catherine of Braganza. She was sweet, dignified, and gentle. Charles, meanwhile, well, Charles had more mistresses than he had functioning government plans. Catherine produced no children through no fault of her own will. Charles fathered at least a dozen with various women, and then politely but firmly refused to legitimize any of them, because monarchy is nothing if not inconsistent. France, the Bourbons, and their disastrous domestic lives. Let's drift to Versailles, where the hallways were polished, the wigs were large, and the marriages were miserable. Louis XIV, the Sun King, married Maria Theresa of Spain, another heavily inbred Habsburg. She was quiet, soft-spoken, and unfortunately overshadowed by Louis's collection of glamorous mistresses. Louis XIV treated monogamy like a polite suggestion. Maria Theresa once said, "There is nothing left for me to do but pray," which, historically speaking, is French quinquote for "My life is a circus I did not audition for." Their son married yet another Habsburg princess, because nothing says we learn from history like repeating it with gusto. And then, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. This marriage was arranged between 2 teenagers who had the combined romantic experience of 0. Louis XVI was shy, gentle, and extremely interested in locks, keys, and avoiding eye contact. Marie Antoinette was 14, stylish, and ready to have fun in a court where fun was considered an act of rebellion. They didn't consummate the marriage for 7 years. 7. This caused international diplomatic panic, because apparently nothing terrifies Europe like young people who are simply not ready. Louis eventually figured things out after. His brother-in-law gave him helpful advice, which is awkward on several levels. Their relationship actually became tender over time. Unfortunately, the French Revolution arrived just as they were starting to get the hang of ruling. Timing was not their strength. Soft transition. Alright, exhale. Slowly, we've drifted through dim halls, awkward wedding nights, and family trees that folded in on themselves, like origami. Royal marriages were rarely fair, rarely healthy, and almost never the romantic fantasies later artists would pretend they were. But they were deeply human. Messy, flawed, and filled with people who probably just wanted a quiet life and instead got a crown, a cousin, and a lifetime of political stress. If you're ready, we can float onward too. The first thing to understand is that medieval royal nurseries were not warm, cozy spaces filled with plush toys and parental bonding. They were cold rooms staffed by an unpredictable blend of servants, wet nurses, and the occasional noblewoman who wandered in because she had nothing better to do. Royal parents rarely raised their children. This was considered normal. In fact, if a king or queen spent too much time with their offspring, the court grew suspicious. People would whisper things like, "Is he ill? Or has she had a revelation? Or are they bonding?" How inappropriate. So royal infants were raised by committees that did not always communicate, or agree, or know how to hold a baby. It builds character, allegedly. The heir's first job. Survive. The most important responsibility of a medieval heir was to simply remain alive. This may sound basic, but it was a monumental task. Children died from fevers, teething, which they believed was fatal drafts, a stiff breeze, the moon being in a bad mood, the nurse sneezing too close. Literally anything medical care consisted of prayers, herbal concoctions, and doctors who believed bloodletting was a solution to everything from earaches to existential dread. In other words, the average royal child spent their formative years being both overprotected and profoundly endangered. Henry VI, the boy who had a kingdom before he had motor skills. Let's drift first to England. Henry VI became king at 9 months old. A time in life when most children are still trying to figure out why hands exist. Naturally, the adults around him immediately made things worse. His advisors argued. His regents plotted. His uncles tried to influence the baby, which given his age meant standing near the cradle with determined expressions. Henry grew into a gentle, anxious, and deeply overwhelmed man. He loved reading. He loved prayer. He did not love ruling. But when your early childhood consisted of everyone shouting about politics while you're trying to nap, well, you adapt in your own quiet way. Ivan the Terrible. Childhood in hard mode. Now we drift into the cold corridors of Moscow. Ivan Forbedder, known as Ivan the Terrible, had a childhood that can gently be described as formative and more accurately described as, oh no. His father died when Ivan was 3. His mother died when he was 8, probably poisoned, because Russia likes to set the tone early. After that, the boy Tsar's guardians mostly ignored him. They fought over power. They stole from the treasury. They let the young Ivan wander the palace like a small, furious ghost. He survived on scraps. Servants kicked him. Noble families played politics above his head like a violent chess game. He grew up to be suspicious, angry, and fond of throwing people off tall buildings. And historians often say he had a difficult childhood, which is academic code for everyone failed this child spectacularly. Charles VI of France, the boy who grew up too fast, too soon drifting to France now, to meet Charles VI who became king at 11. At 11, most children are mastering long division and wondering why adults are so stressed. Charles, however, was managing France. He grew up in the glittering court of the Valois kings, surrounded by luxury and political tension thick enough to chew. His early years were filled with ceremonies, expectations, and relatives arguing over who controlled him. Charles was sensitive, quiet, gentle, and by adulthood, he suffered severe mental illness episodes, so intense he sometimes believed he was made of glass. Historians often trace his struggles back to childhood. The pressure, the instability, the constant parade of uncles with large egos and minimal impulse control. It is almost soothing to think the glace de Luzon wasn't the most fragile thing in that court. Louis XIV, the boy who learned to distrust everyone. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had a childhood that combined poverty, rebellion, fear, and the realization that he might be safer sleeping with one eye open. During his youth, Paris rose up in revolt. The royal family fled. At one point, Louis, barely old enough to read, was woken in the night because rioters were outside the door. He never forgot, which is why, as an adult, he built Versailles in the countryside, a place where the nearest rebellious mob would need a snack break, a comfortable pair of shoes, and sheer determination to reach him. His childhood lesson was clear. Trust no one, but do invest heavily in ornate fountains. Medieval education, where royal tutors despaired quietly by age 6 or 7. Royal children were plunged into education with the enthusiasm of someone being pushed into a cold lake. They learned Latin, heraldry, religion, dancing, manners, how to look regal without falling off a horse. Some excelled. Some tolerated it. Some, like Richard II, decided that education was fine, but being adored was better. Royal tutors wrote letters full of gentle complaints, such as, "His Majesty is intelligent, but is highly distracted. He prefers falconry to grammar. He refuses to do mathematics unless bribed." To be fair, many modern adults feel the same. The princesses, sheltered, controlled, and terminally bored royal daughters did not have it easier. They were raised like fragile diplomatic packages. Princesses were taught obedience, embroidery language is more embroidery, how to nod politely at men who made bad decisions, how to leave the country at 14 and marry someone they'd never met, and additional embroidery. Many lived lonely lives, locked into strict routines inside stone walls, preparing for political marriages that ranged from awkward to catastrophic. Princess Isabella of France, for instance, was raised quietly in the French court before being sent to England to marry Edward II, the man who preferred the company of his favorites, and whose marriage would politely be described as strained. She later engineered a coup, so, she found hobbies. Sickly heirs, everyone's worst nightmare, because royal families intermarried extensively. Sickly heirs were common, very common. Entire courts panicked over every cough. Heirs were wrapped in too many blankets, fed elaborate diets, given herbal remedies that absolutely did not work, diagnosed by court physicians who were 90% guesswork and 10% wishful thinking. Some children survived despite their caretaking, others despite their caretakers. Edward VI of England was frail from the start. He loved books, he loved learning. He did not love being alive, apparently because he died at 15 after a long illness. The kingdom spiraled into chaos, and Mary I eventually took the throne, bringing a very different kind of childhood trauma to bear. The spoiled ones. Because every era has nepo babies, not all royal children suffered though. Some were spoiled to alarming degrees. Take Louis XV's son, the Dauphin Louis. He was so coddled that he reportedly thought regular people lived in a kind of perpetual carnival where dinner appeared magically. When he once witnessed poverty firsthand, he responded with the emotional depth of a child seeing a pigeon for the first time. His own son, Louis XVI, inherited a similar palace, bobaladingshines, social anxiety, and a lock-picking hobby, which is charming now, but at the time, the court found it mildly concerning. Loneliness, the universal royal childhood theme despite their wealth and privilege. Many royal children were profoundly lonely. They had strict schedules, limited interactions, constant scrutiny, enormous pressure, and very few people who actually knew them. They were surrounded by servants, but not by affection, raised by committees, but rarely by parents. It creates a very specific kind of child, one who grows into an adult both painfully sheltered and prematurely burdened, which explains a lot of monarchs, frankly, soft transition. So, take a slow breath, let the nursery fade, let the cold stone, stiff ceremonial garments, and anxious tutors drift quietly into the dark. We've wandered through the cradle years of Europe's most influential and most emotionally unprepared. We can float onward to something equally soothing and ridiculous. If you'd like, our next chapter can be take a breath, let your shoulders sink, and imagine a long wooden table, groaning under gold goblets, stale bread, and the crushing emotional immaturity of Europe's ruling class. Because tonight, we're drifting through royal pettiness. Richard II, the king who never met a grudge he didn't cherish. Let's start with England's Richard II, a king who believed deeply that emotional stability was for peasants. Richard was elegant, stylish, fond of dramatic gestures. He also held grudges with the dedication of a man embroidering them into pillowcases. For example, when some nobles opposed him politically, Richard patiently waited years before retaliating. Then when everyone assumed he'd forgotten, he had them arrested or executed with the quiet satisfaction of someone finally cleaning out a messy closet. Richard's reign ended with him being deposed. He was shocked. Everyone else was not. Queen Isabella of England, professionally petty, recreationally vengeful. Drifting back a little earlier, we find Isabella of France, wife of Edward II. Isabella, nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, became spectacularly petty when she realized her husband preferred the company of his male favorites to her own. So she formed alliances behind his back, took their son to France, returned with an army, toppled the king, and installed the boy as the new ruler. This was not a minor overreaction. This was the medieval equivalent of changing all the passwords and seizing the family home. Her husband died shortly afterward in mysterious circumstances. Isabella denied involvement, which is what people always say when they are absolutely involved. Louis XI of France, the spider king who trusted no one, ever. Louis XI was so distrustful and paranoid that even his paranoia was suspicious of his other paranoia. He preferred to communicate through spies. He hoarded poisons. He kept astrologers, but only to ignore their advice. He once imprisoned a duke in an iron cage for years, then acted offended when people called him severe. Louis XI's pettiness was quiet, not loud, dramatic tantrums, but soft, simmering vengeance served at room temperature. He would literally ghost people by retreating to a private fortress and refusing to answer messages. A medieval king, using the power of not replying. Timeless behavior. Peter the Great, the Tsar who couldn't handle criticism now. Let's drift to Russia again. Peter the Great modernized his country, built ships, reformed the government, created schools, but also reacted to criticism with the emotional resilience of wet toast. When the Streltsy elite guards rebelled, he responded by personally supervising their torture and which is not the recommended leadership method. Peter also forced nobles to shave their beards. They resisted. He taxed the beards. They resisted more. He cut some off himself because compromise was not his strong suit. To be fair, Europe was not ready for a 6 feet 7 inches man running around with scissors. Queen Anne and Sarah Churchill, a friendship so petty it shaped the nation. Queen Anne of England had a close friendship with Sarah Churchill, intense, emotional, and eventually catastrophically petty. Sarah wanted power. Anne wanted loyalty. Neither wanted to communicate like adults. At one point, Sarah scolded the queen so harshly that courtiers described Anne as crying softly behind a curtain, which is both tragic and astonishingly relatable. Their friendship collapsed in slow, dramatic fashion. Sarah wrote accusatory letters and avoided her. Sarah insisted on being right and insisted on silence. Parliament got involved because of course it did eventually, and replaced Sarah with her quieter, more compliant cousin, Abigail, prompting Sarah to have a meltdown so large it probably registered on early sight. Philip the Fair. Attractive face. Un attractif. Personality. Philip IV of France was known as the Fair, though accounts suggest this referred mostly to his bone structure. Personality-wise, he was about as warm as a marble bench. If Odid with the Pope, the Knights Templar, his own daughter Zinla, anyone who annoyed him and Hermolicles. Probably when Philip discovered that the wives of his sons might be having affairs, he orchestrated a dramatic scandal in which the men were tortured and the women were imprisoned. Subtlety was not his love language. Christian VII of Denmark. Dysfunction with a side of delusion. Christian VII ascended the throne young, fragile, and mentally unwell. He neglected state matters, preferred pranks, and occasionally forgot he was king. He once slapped nobles for fun. He ran through hallways screaming. He hallucinated. He distrusted everyone except his doctor man, who then proceeded to have an affair with the queen. Royal dysfunction at its finest. The entire court behaved like a soap opera written by someone who fell asleep halfway through. Charles the Bold, the man who mistook recklessness for strategies. Charles, Duke of Burgundy, was bold mostly in the sense that he made decisions first and thought later. If ever, he had a talent for bad alliances, worse battles, catastrophic stubbornness. He once declared war on the Swiss, believing they would politely surrender. They did not. He died in battle. The Swiss went back to their lives. Unimpressed, Charles's pettiness extended even to fashion. He banned fur-lined slippers at one point because he believed they were too comfortable. History suggests Charles needed a nap. Soft transition, take a slow breath. Let the bickering monarchs, the emotional meltdowns, the grudges, and the very regal temper tantrums drift into silence. We've wandered through centuries of pettiness, the kind that shaped wars, toppled governments, and occasionally rearranged entire borders because someone woke up in a mood. If you're ready, we can drift on to the next chapter.